Hundreds of people are doing unbelievable things in our country, and sometimes they do it under a blanket, almost undercover. At his peak, Cliff Richard was one of the biggest stars Britain had ever seen. For decades, he was the voice of joy, the symbol of decency. But the man who never seemed to fall would find himself at the center of the biggest scandal of his life. What followed was a devastating period that nearly broke him. He tried to rebuild and move forward, but nothing ever felt the same again. And now at 85, unmarried, childless, and facing a heartbreaking health challenge, things aren't looking so good for the man who once dominated the entire entertainment industry. Most people describe Cliff Richard as Britain's polite answer to Elvis Presley. He has sold more than 250 million records, placed 68 singles in the British top 10, and received a knighthood from the Queen. For 6 decades, his voice has been one of the most familiar sounds in popular music. But the man who sang about joy and celebration has lived a life marked by a loneliness most people would never imagine. Cliff Richard was born on October 14, 1940, in northern British India. His father managed a catering contractor that serviced the Indian Railways, while his mother raised Cliff alongside his 3 sisters. The family lived comfortably enough by the standards of the time, but that security rested on a government structure that was already beginning to crumble. When Indian independence came in 1947, the family faced a choice that thousands of British families in India had to make: stay in a country that no longer wanted them, or return to a homeland most of them had never really known. They chose to leave. They sold their belongings, packed what remained, and boarded a ship for a 3-week voyage to Tilbury, Essex. But the England they found was not the England they had seen in postcards. There was no warm welcome waiting at the docks. From relative wealth in India, they had descended into something closer to survival in post-war Britain. Eventually, the family moved to a 3-bedroom council house in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, and that is where the true hardship began. Money was so tight that 3 times a week, dinner consisted of nothing but hot tea and toast sprinkled with sugar. That meal was not a treat or a nostalgic memory. It was the only thing they could afford. Cliff attended school from 1952 to 1957, where he placed in the top stream and excelled at athletics, playing football for his school and eventually for the county of Hertfordshire. But the thing that truly grabbed hold of him was music, specifically the American rock and roll he heard on records. His parents thought it was a dreadful noise, but Cliff thought it was the future. When he was 16, his father bought him a guitar, an act of reluctant support that would prove transformative. Not long after, Cliff left school and took a job as a filing clerk in an electrical factory. But the job was just a way to pass the time until the music could take over. He formed groups, performed cover versions of current hits, and eventually built his own rock group. At his manager's request, he changed his name from Harry Webb to Cliff Richard to suit the music industry. His real breakthrough arrived in 1958 at Abbey Road Studios, where producer Nori Perma from Emmy's Columbia label invited him to audition. The plan was to record a song called Schoolboy Crush as the A-side, with Move It tucked away on the B-side. Move It reached number 2 on the UK singles chart that autumn, and British rock and roll had its first homegrown star. From there, the achievements came faster than anyone could track. He would make the UK singles charts in every one of its first 6 decades, a feat shared only with Elvis Presley, stacking up 68 top 10 singles and 14 number ones, including 4 Christmas number ones, more than any other artist. But none of that success fixed what was quietly broken underneath. The polite smile and the flawless suits covered a personal life that never found the same kind of victory. In August 2014, Cliff Richard was in Portugal on holiday when he turned on a television and watched police officers search his home. He had not been told the search was happening, nor had he been told why. He learned about it the same way millions of viewers did, through live coverage broadcast from a helicopter hovering above his apartment. The story that led to that moment began nearly 30 years earlier in 1985 at a football stadium in Sheffield, where a teenage boy in the crowd would years later make a horrifying allegation against him. For a public figure who had built his entire career on a clean-cut, family-friendly image, the accusation alone carried the potential to destroy everything. Officers were already working on a major inquiry launched after the Jimmy Savile scandal, and in July 2014, the information was passed to South Yorkshire Police. Before the search took place, a BBC journalist learned that the investigation existed. What happened between the police and the BBC would later be described in court as a deal. The BBC agreed to delay breaking the story. In return, South Yorkshire police agreed to tip them off about the exact timing of the raid. On the day of the search, the BBC broadcast live footage from a helicopter already hovering above Cliff Richard's address. Viewers watched officers on his property, while the man at the center of it watched from a hotel room in Portugal, having received no warning from anyone. The coverage treated him, as one human rights lawyer later put it, like a bank robber or a mass murderer. After the raid, the BBC even nominated its coverage for a broadcasting award, a decision that would later carry legal consequences. For 2 full years, the investigation hung over his life. He continued to deny the allegation consistently and completely. On June 16, 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service announced there was insufficient evidence to proceed with any charges. Cliff Richard was never arrested and never charged. The investigation closed without a single legal finding against him. But the damage was already done. The live broadcast had been seen by millions, and the story had traveled around the world. His reputation, built over 56 years of relentless work, had been stained in a single day. He filed suit against both South Yorkshire Police and the BBC, and when the High Court delivered its verdict in July 2018, the ruling was clear. The BBC had infringed his privacy rights without legal justification and in a serious and sensationalist way. The damages were substantial, and the police force had already settled separately for £400,000. But Cliff Richard testified that the case had cost him £3.4 million in total, including lawyers and lost business. A man who had spent decades avoiding scandal had become the subject of a scandal that did not even exist. The 2 years between the raid and the CPS announcement were not simply stressful. They were physically and mentally devastating. He lost a considerable amount of weight, not because he was trying to, but because the stress consumed him. His body succumbed to shingles, a condition that often flares when the immune system is under prolonged attack from anxiety and sleeplessness. He told the court that at one point he genuinely thought he was going to have a heart attack or a stroke. Sleep became its own punishment, with nights spent replaying conversations that had never happened and imagining outcomes that never came. He described the period as feeling as though everything he had worked for during his life was being torn apart. After the raid, he never lived in his Sunningdale apartment again. He said the space had become contaminated. He returned only to pack his belongings, and even that was difficult. Cliff Richard has sold more records than almost any other British artist in history, and has headlined arenas on 5 continents. Yet he has never walked down an aisle or heard someone call him dad. He has consistently said this was a conscious choice, not a lack of opportunity. The first reason he gives is his faith. He became a devout Christian in 1965 and believes marriage requires total commitment, a level of commitment he did not feel able to balance with a career that sent him around the world for months at a time. He also valued his independence deeply and, for most of his life, genuinely did not feel lonely. A third reason was more pragmatic. He did not want to risk entering marriage only to face divorce, which conflicted with his religious beliefs. Better not to marry at all, he reasoned, than to marry and fail. There was one woman he truly loved. In the 1970s, he admitted to being in love with singer and actress Olivia Newton-John, but she was already engaged to someone else when those feelings were at their strongest. She viewed him as a dear friend and eventually married twice, including to his own best friend. Cliff remained close to her for the rest of her life. There were other women too, including relationships with a dancer and an actress, and a connection with tennis champion turned broadcaster, Sue Barker, that evolved from romance into lifelong friendship. But none of those relationships led to marriage. He later admitted publicly that he sometimes wondered whether he would ever truly be loved, given the life he had chosen. He described coming home from the stage to silence and questioning whether he had missed something beautiful, not romantic love specifically, but family, a shared life, a daily presence. In late 2024, doctors discovered prostate cancer during a routine insurance checkup ahead of a planned tour. He had not requested the tests himself. The promoter needed the paperwork to secure coverage, and the medical examination that followed revealed something that could have remained hidden until it was too late. On December 15, 2025, he appeared on morning television and announced that the cancer was gone, though he said it carefully, with no celebration, adding immediately that he did not know whether it would return because nobody can know those things. Then he made a plea that came from somewhere personal. He urged people to get tested and get checked, speaking as a man who had looked at a diagnosis and understood exactly how close he had come to a very different outcome. The physical decline fans have noticed in recent years is real. At his December 2025 concert, audience members observed that he could no longer move around the stage the way he once did, and his speaking voice sounded fragile. But those same fans noted something that continues to puzzle people who see him perform. His singing voice remains as strong as ever. He has drawn a firm distinction between stopping and retiring. Retirement sounds final to him, like a door bolted shut forever. Stopping is different because it means he could change his mind. He completed the Can't Stop Me Now tour at the Royal Albert Hall in December 2025, a title that was deliberately defiant, but also simply true. He has been stopped repeatedly by scandal, by law, by age, and by cancer, and he keeps standing up anyway. He was once the most famous unmarried man in Britain, a figure of endless speculation and quiet mystery. Now he is simply an old man who lives alone, sings in public, and waits to see what his body will allow him to do next.